Hello. The United States Agency for International Development, or USAID for short, can't be a bad thing, right? Well, as is usual with well-intentioned American institutions, there's another less savory side.
The presence of the United States is, as a leading power in the free world, is involved in your work directly. The people who are opposed to aid should realize that this is a very powerful source of strength for us. It permits us to exert influence for the maintenance of freedom. If we did not, were not so heavily involved, our voice would not speak with such vigor. And as we do not want to send American troops to a great many areas where freedom may be under attack, we send you.
USAID, established in 1961 under President John F. Kennedy, was framed as a humanitarian organization aimed at promoting social and economic development in the Global South. In reality, it was just another piece of a larger Cold War strategy. The Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 centralized foreign aid under USAID, and explicitly meant to oppose Soviet influence through economic diplomacy. This soft power approach was in reality a cover for humanitarian programs to serve as tools to advance US geopolitical interests. As Lyndon B. Johnson later admitted, food aid was meant to redirect recipient spending for military equipment or security purposes. A perfect example of this is Johnson's Food for Peace program, which was meant to discourage countries from accepting any help from the USSR rather than focus on helping the hungry or starving. Necessary famine aid for India wasn't provided until India agreed to stop criticizing the US war on Vietnam. While USAID claimed to support self-reliance, its official reasoning prioritized counteracting drivers of violence and expanding democracy and free markets, badly masked floral language objectives that ultimately serve American capital interests. Post 9/11, USAID saw a budget surge, a 70% increase from 2001 to 2003, which tied development to US military objectives, meaning national security, which just goes to show how little good USAID aimed to do in the first place. After the illegal and undemocratic dissolution of the USSR, USAID shifted its focus to sustainable development, meaning tailoring aid to neoliberal reforms. It targeted post-Soviet states to establish functioning democracies, but only if that democracy functions in US economic interests. This is something I've covered in my Poland and Romania videos here. By the 2000s, the agency funded attempts to rebuild the governments the US destroyed in Afghanistan and Iraq, while framing its loose and ineffectual poverty reduction programs as addressing the root causes of instability, rather than, the illegal American invasions. The Trump regime has, as of this video, practically abolished USAID, justifying it as a major cost-cutting measure. This has accidentally also meant freezing American programs critical to countering China's Belt and Road Initiative, for example, amongst other covert American actions. Let's take a look at some, shall we? Back to the video in just a second. Let's hear from today's sponsor, Fume. Have you ever caught yourself reaching for a bad habit? Well, now there's a better option. A fresh alternative that's satisfying and guilt-free. Meet Fume. Fume is not a vape, nor is it a pipe. It's an award-winning flavored air device that draws flavor into your mouth, not your lungs, making a healthier alternative to vaping. With options like crisp mint and black licorice, there's something for everyone, without the harmful effects. That's right, no vapor and no nicotine. And here's what makes Fume even better. It's also a fidget-friendly tool with magnetic clicks to keep your hands busy and ease anxiety. Its sleek, solid design makes it easy to carry anywhere, plus it's more affordable than a bad habit, with no batteries or chargers. Ready to join over 300,000 people building better habits? Use my code Hakeem at checkout. And if you order the Journey Pack, you'll get a free Fume topper, an awesome accessory to enhance your Fume device. Visit tryfume.com/Hakeem or scan the QR code on your screen to start your journey now. That's tryfume.com/Hakeem, and don't forget to use my code for your exclusive offer. Sponsors have been scarce recently, so extra thanks to Fume for the sponsorship and allowing me to pay my editor fairly. Alright, back to the video.
A similar effort that has been made by the President.
In 1973, Senator Ted Kennedy wrote to the CIA asking if US aid was involved in Southeast Asian operations. Secretary of State at the time, Henry Kissinger, confirmed that this was indeed the case, which led former CIA officer John Chirico to call USAID a propaganda adjunct of the CIA. By 1970, the genocide of the Mayan population in Guatemala was well underway following a series of counterinsurgency actions carried out by a series of US-backed military dictatorships in the country. The police force of Guatemala specifically needed, quote-unquote, counterinsurgency training. Here, USAID stepped in to train, organize, and pay for at least 30,000 police officers. This form of training is best seen in another example. In Uruguay, around the same time, USAID's Dan Mitrione specialized in teaching police officers the best way to torture people, using, and I quote, electrical shocks to sensitive areas of the body, using drugs to induce vomiting, and other psychological torture techniques. Demonstrations of these methods were carried out on live subjects, where Mitrione's agents kidnapped beggars from the street and subsequently tortured them to death. He would eventually be captured by guerrillas and rightfully executed. The Nixon administration stated at his death that his devoted service to the cause of peaceful progress in an orderly world will remain as an example for free men everywhere. What an example. Continuing in Latin America, in the 1980s, USAID was managing non-lethal aid to the Contras after Congress tried to distance the program from the CIA following the Iran-Contra scandal. By 1988, USAID was feeding and clothing 30,000 Contra fighters and their families. Despite claims of humanitarian intent, USAID's role was simple: to maintain the Contras' state of readiness. A well-supplied, combat-ready army can be used as leverage in peace negotiations, which had the opposite effect. It prolonged the conflict. Unsurprisingly, indigenous Americans were frequently politically active across Latin America as a result of centuries of oppression. Between 1996 and 2000, Peruvian dictator Alberto Fujimori ordered the forced sterilization of 300,000 mostly indigenous women, and USAID gave him $35 million to do it. No American official has ever faced any legal consequences for this horrific act. Between 1984 and 1994, USAID granted $51 million to the University of Nebraska's Afghanistan Studies Center to produce textbooks for Afghani children. These texts weaponized education, embedding anti-communist propaganda into basic arithmetic even. One group of mujahideen attacks 50 Russian soldiers. In the attack, 20 Russians were killed. How many Russians fled? Religiously flavored propaganda was also explicit. D is for deen, meaning religion. Our religion is Islam. The Russians are the enemies of the religion of Islam. If that's true, then so are the Americans, but I digress. USAID's Islamabad office funneled even more of this innocent, non-lethal aid to Afghani mujahideen in Pakistan, including funds diverted to purchase weapons. A portion of these weapons ended up arming Pakistani radicals opposing Muhammad Zia al-Haq, while USAID money also financed luxury vehicles for mujahideen commanders. USAID prioritized destabilizing Soviet influence over actually helping anyone, and helped create the highly unstable situation we currently have in the country. Of course, that's not to say Socialist Afghanistan or the Soviets made no mistakes, but we made a dedicated deprogram episode about that here. In Venezuela, US sanctions, beginning in 2017, crippled Venezuela's oil economy, causing hyperinflation, food insecurity for millions, and a migrant crisis. These sanctions precipitated healthcare collapse and widening poverty, while blocking Red Cross aid imports. At the same time, leaked US embassy documents exposed USAID's funneling of $116 million to Carlos Vecchio, a fugitive opposition figure appointed as an ambassador under Juan Guaido's sham US-backed interim government. These funds, supposedly for developmental assistance, were instead diverted to opposition-aligned NGOs and politicians abroad, many living in luxury while ordinary Venezuelans face shortages as a result of US-imposed economic sanctions. Recently, FBI investigations revealed Guaido and his allies had embezzled over $1 billion in US aid, meaning only 2% of the aid was used for humanitarian purposes. This, of course, is by design. The US government isn't stupid. This corruption is part of how USAID's democracy promotion entrenches dependency on foreign-funded networks that prioritize regime change. It ensures that these opposition figures never bite the hand that feeds. Add to this the fact that regional media was nearly 90% dependent on USAID grants, and you have quite the cocktail. This became a problem recently because, with the Trump regime freezing USAID's global operations, many civil societies and democracy promotion groups and independent media outlets started closing up shop, magically, almost as if they were bankrolled by the US government to push regime change. Oh my. Well, they were, and I've made another dedicated video on that here. But let's take a closer look at the so-called independent media. USAID has been spending over $250 million per year training a network of more than 6,200 reporters working for almost 1,000 outlets or organizations, this time under the guise of promoting independent media. The shutdown of USAID shows just how much pro-US content out there is astroturfed by this supposedly aid-based organization, and exposes just how much major parts of the global media are nothing but an adjunct to US propaganda and foreign policy interests. Interesting to note, not one single outlet with a radical leftist perspective has received so much as a cent from USAID. So much for the independent part of independent media. Echoing this point was the CEO of USAID-supported organizations in Bosnia, who said, bluntly, if you are funded by the US government, there are certain topics that you would simply not go after, because the US government has its interests that are above all others. In Ukraine, following the 2014 Euromaidan protests, the US allocated $44 billion in foreign assistance to Ukraine through USAID, Treasury, and USDA, explicitly targeting vague democratic transition work. These grants would bankroll political work that would eventually lead to the freezing of elections and the banning of all opposition parties, including the several highly popular communist parties within Ukraine. The Trump regime's 2025 freeze on USAID projects abruptly stopped some of this work that had continued into the war, with journalists writing for the Kiev Independent noting that regional media, which is 90% reliant on US grants, faces total collapse. In Syria, it was USAID's stabilization programs that advanced US geopolitical aims under the guise of humanitarian effort. Its objectives explicitly targeted regime change, focusing on demilitarizing Syria, reorienting its government towards a pro-US foreign policy, and ensuring it doesn't threaten Israel. Investigative reporting reveals deeper ties. USAID contracted Creative Associates International for projects like Zunio, a Cuban Twitter clone designed to foment dissent, under the same civil society support program used to destabilize Syria, Libya, and Egypt. CAI's parent company, Creative Associates International Inc., they're not very creative, operated as a CIA front in Pakistan, collaborating with Blackwater mercenaries to conduct cross-border raids into Afghanistan. It's all interconnected. In other attempts, USAID framed its covert regime change efforts in Cuba under the guise of public health. Documents and operatives reveal that USAID explicitly viewed HIV prevention workshops as a perfect excuse to mask anti-government activities, attempting to leverage medical outreach to infiltrate Cuban society. Young Latin American recruits with no undercover experience or training, paid as little as $5 an hour, posed as tourists to target universities, using workshops to train activists in organizing tactics, while gathering intelligence. Despite USAID's public defense that the program enabled support for Cuban civil society while addressing HIV education, internal communications exposed its primary focus: recruiting people to destabilize the Cuban government. The obvious ethical violations drew sharp condemnation from around the world. Interaction, a coalition of global NGOs, condemned the exploitation of health initiatives for intelligence operations, stating, "The US government should never sacrifice delivering basic health services to advance an intelligence goal." Even USAID's own contractors admitted the HIV workshops were strategically designed as a perfect excuse to evade Cuban scrutiny. Senator Patrick Leahy, overseeing USAID funding, criticized the agency for prioritizing contractor profits over its humanitarian mission, noting it tarnishes USAID's long track record as a leader in global health. The State Department, however, doubled down, with White House spokesperson and eventual MSNBC host Jen Psaki asserting such programs as promoting democracy worldwide, basically saying the quiet bit out loud that American-funded civil societies are used by the CIA for government destabilization purposes. Of course, not all of them, but when you don't know which is which, it's better to be on the safer side and assume that it's being used for American foreign policy interests. As in Venezuela and Ukraine, USAID's shutdown had shaken a Miami-based anti-Cuban government outlet called CubaNet. It turned to its readers for funding in a desperate plea stating, "We are facing an unexpected challenge, the suspension of key funding that sustains part of our work." That key funding was coming from USAID. Cuba's long-standing and extremely well-evidenced accusations of US-backed destabilization gained even further credibility as the scandal unfolded. The Cuban government has repeatedly warned that foreign civil society programs served as fronts for destabilization. The US scheme risked irreparably damaging global trust in public health initiatives, with HIV prevention now potentially seen as a dangerous front for seditious activity, much like fake vaccination programs conducted by the US in Pakistan when searching for Osama bin Laden. The fallout extended to diplomatic relations as well. A declassified State Department review condemned the US response to the ensuing crisis as plagued by a lack of senior leadership, ineffective communications, and systemic disorganization, basically incompetence at all levels. In 2017, the CIA abruptly withdrew from Havana, with its tail between its legs. While liberal pundits have been singing USAID's praises and touting its so-called accomplishments, the international reception has been interesting, with many finding common ground in welcoming their treat of USAID funding. El Salvador's President Nayib Bukele, himself a bit too close for comfort to American foreign policy, said, "Most governments don't want USAID funds flowing into their countries because they understand where much of that money actually ends up. At best, maybe 10% of the money reaches real projects that help people in need. There are such cases. But the rest is used to fuel dissent, finance protests, and undermine administrations that refuse to align with the globalist agenda." I hate populist speak, but you get his point. Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro, stated, "While the press may be lamenting the demise of USAID-backed media, many heads of states are not. Take your money with you, it's poison." Since tools of empire often come home to bite the empire's citizens, the so-called imperial boomerang, referred to JT's great video here for more, It shouldn't be a surprise that the US Department of Defense employs a minimum of 60,000 people whose only job is to influence public opinion from behind a keyboard. Basically the largest undercover troll army in the world, who are very likely breaking domestic and international law. These so-called Twitter files revealed a real campaign by the Department of Defense and Twitter to carry out an influence operation across the Middle East. Another aspect of this deep control, or at least heavy influence, of social media by the government was revealed by a Mint Press investigation that found that apps like Facebook, Twitter, Google, Reddit, and even TikTok are filled with former CIA and USAID officials, amongst others, from other national security agencies. And yet, according to an internal document, USAID is frustrated by those same sites, plus Twitch and 4chan and Discord, because users are able to build communities that lead them to populist rhetoric and the challenging of US government narratives. The document goes on to outline methods of suppressing actually existing independent media, such as threatening advertisers into cutting ties with websites to strangle their finances. Later, USAID suggests directing people to mainstream, corporate-owned outlets to psychologically inoculate themselves against inconvenient facts that challenge US hegemony. This so-called pre-bunking, which includes discrediting the brand, the credibility, and reputation of those making supposed false allegations, is just a euphemism for a policy of the state censoring or trying to censor media it can't control, and those critical of the US government. USAID's operations are inseparable from America's imperialist objectives. They're designed to counter foreign so-called enemies with varying degrees of success. Crucial for the system are people and programs who assist in diverting aid funds to corporations and oligarchs through rigged financial systems, coercion, and violence, a Cold War-era strategy refined to secure resource extraction and political compliance for the American ruling class. During the Cold War, the US appointed itself the leader of a democratic camp against socialist states, using aid to sympathetic countries and populations to isolate them. Foreign aid spending peaked at 4.7% of the federal budget in 1963, but collapsed to 0.6% by 1989 when the Soviet Union was in decline, revealing USAID's overtly transactional purpose. If it really was about poverty alleviation or whatever other positive goals, the funding wouldn't follow the ebb and flow of American politics. Modern priorities make this even more clear. $14 billion in direct aid to Ukraine for the war against Russia, and $3.3 billion annually to Israel, not to mention the many other grants and funding, but not a cent to the American public. Monroe Doctrine types say that dismantling USAID risks ceding regions like Africa and Latin America to rival powers, as if these areas were theirs to do with as they wish, eliminating decades of NGO-driven soft power. The language really is disgusting. The World Bank's Eugene Black explicitly stated that aid was meant to maintain the West's political and economic dynamic in the Global South, a stance mirrored in USAID's funneling of loans to privatized infrastructure projects in the modern day. Aid programs prioritize corporate profits over local welfare. Loans to nations like Ecuador are structured to enrich firms like Bechtel and Halliburton, indebting countries and forcing resource extraction. This promotion of democracy and free markets masks a more nefarious neoliberal project. Crises, real or imagined, are weaponized to enforce mass privatization, especially of state institutions. I made a video on privatization recently, which you can see here. This also bites at home. After Hurricane Katrina destroyed New Orleans, the city replaced 123 public schools with 31 charter schools, leading to the firing of 4,700 unionized teachers to benefit contractors, a template that's been replicated globally. The doctrine that only a crisis produces real change underpins the strategy. When economic coercion fails, military intervention, or the threat of it, typically ensures compliance. Ultimately though, domestic politics drive aid fluctuations and always prioritize petty, partisan interests over general welfare. Not only that, but the public doesn't care about this topic. US public ambivalence towards aid should be sobering to anybody who looks at it. Only 18% of Americans prioritize promoting democracy abroad, which makes sense as most Americans are struggling and don't have a democracy at home to begin with. USAID's whole story boils down to this: aid as a profit machine and foreign policy arm wrapped in a helping hand. From the Cold War onward, it's been about control. Starve India into shutting up about Vietnam? Sure. Radicalize Afghani children with CIA math books? Why not? Bankroll Venezuelan opposition grifters? Absolutely. Every humanitarian move doubles as geopolitical chess. Undercutting rivals, propping up puppet regimes, cracking open markets with fire sales, turning public goods into private cash cows, the list goes on. It's colonialism with extra steps. Loans trap nations in forever debt. NGOs act very frequently as imperial middlemen. Crises become excuses to privatize everything. USA doesn't fix poverty, it needs poverty to justify its existence, and pushes for the foreign policy interests of capital at every turn. Aid is just empire maintenance, with better PR. A better world is possible. A little addendum at the end. I don't want anybody to misunderstand me and assume that all aid is negative. It's just that when aid, particularly coming from governments with an expressed interest in influencing local politics, is handed out, there are usually political or other caveats that are attached to it. The United States has never done anything out of the kindness of their own heart. Their own history reveals this. If they're giving aid to a particular country, they're doing it to advance a particular interest. Now, whether that interest is towards infrastructure projects that are privately funded so that American corporations benefit, or it's towards civil NGOs that will then influence local politics so that they can bring about regime change, it doesn't really matter. But there's enough evidence to indicate that one should be wary of particularly USAID, but just aid in general, especially in the form of NGOs and civil societies and democracy-promoting groups, so on and so forth. There's a reason why undemocratic American allies don't get any media time or scrutiny or critique. Meanwhile, other nations are not so lucky. Use a bit of critical thinking. That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Nitro Dubs, Kenny, Thomas Roberts, Nicholas, Owen Baker, T. Wood, Dr. Lemonman, Lumix, Charlie and Eric, Ultimate Turin, Daniel Ethel, The Generic Guy, Santiago Pereira, Rain, Cassandra Corbus, David Fries, Confuse M, Mariana Mostusevich, Robbie Richardson, and Masay Kadro. Thanks for watching.